Okay, welcome to part two here. We're going to talk about human ecology and the city and sort of applying some of these ecological principles to human systems and how those work in the city. And so this sort of thinking started in Chicago. It came out of the Chicago school where actually some of the ideas about plant ecology and succession, some of those ideas were coming out of Chicago too around this time. And some of these were sort of merged together in the early 1900s. And one of the first models to sort of start thinking about this in this way was the ring model, and it came from the Chicago School, and it emphasized this deterministic progression towards complexity, following a plant ecology model where you had these rings. Um, I forget the guy. I forget the person who came up with this original idea, but it was sort of a ring model where where each city you could sort of model where there were different zones, a factory zone and a transition zone, and then working homes zone and residential and commuter zones. Would Each city would fit this model, and you would have this transition towards this complexity, which means these inner rings were going to be sort of replacing outer rings as the city expanded. And it followed this plant ecology idea of succession towards some stable state, I guess. In that sense, it was sort of not really correct. It came out of Chicago, and they modeled a lot of it off of Chicago. And here's what it looks like if you actually apply it to Chicago, and it sort of fits. I mean, you have these transition zones, and you have working, and then residential and commuter zones. But that was really the only Chicago was really the only model that it fit super well. And so they were kind of modeling their own space there, and maybe sort of a feedback loop as to pulling their ideas from Chicago and trying to create an idea from that. But ultimately, it was based off this idea where the state of maximum development was a type of fixed climax, just as the plant ecologist had originally proposed, but it turned out to be wrong. Those ideas, the idea of a successional community that develops towards this climax community is just an oversimplification. And we know that communities are almost always dynamic and always in flux. And so they don't like get to this stable period really ever. And so it's just this sort of idea that didn't really pan out. But that it influenced a lot of early thought, and there were a lot of critiques of the Chicago school. So one is that it relied heavily, maybe not heavily, but it was there were environmental determinism ideals wrapped up in there. And if you're not familiar with this, it's sort of this part of geography that in parts of ecology that sort of said that human societies were a construct of the environment that they existed in, and how far they progressed or didn't progress, or whatever their state was sort of determined by their climate and by their environment, and didn't sort of excluded things like culture and all sorts of other factors, and has some racist history. And so that's a valid critique, and environmental determinism is not something you want wrapped up in your theories. Also relied exclusively on competition between these zones and between different entities, and that while competition may exist, it's not the only driving force out there. It was spatially deterministic, and this was again one of the main downfalls, and that we know is just not how these systems operate. And it dismissed social heterogeneity. So within those zones, there's all sorts of heterogeneity. In between zones, by using the zone ring model, you're just not really getting at the fine scale heterogeneity that we know exists in cities. So we've sort of moved on to a modern approach that's a socio-spatial approach that takes into account social factors and displays them on a spatial sort of template, where we're looking at how do these patches interact, how do the social constructs within these patches, how do they spread across patches and influence changes over time and over space. There's two sort of main parts of this or components of this. One is a quantification, so we're quantifying, you know, if we're taking the patch model, then we're quantifying things. You know, how are the different patches configured, and how do the social constructs. You may not, maybe you're categorizing patches not based on you know, the physical landscape, but the social landscape. And we're also integrating different ideas. So we're integrating stuff from ecology, but we're also integrating sociology and urban theory, and using some of those ideas to explain some of the patch dynamics as well. And within the sociospatial theory, or the modern approaches of the sociospatial approach, there's some ecological perspectives that have been put forth, and all of these sort of have different strengths and different theories, or different strengths and weaknesses. There's the organic theory, which is sort of thinking about a city as a organic body, and there are different components to it that are necessary. But there's some different ways. It's an interesting way of thinking about it, but it's sort of incomplete. There's a reading after this, so I'm going to let you read about each one of these on your own. But there's also the city as a modifier of nature approach, where humans are actually modifying nature in certain ways, and looks at how different modifications alter the landscape. There's the ecological theory of the Chicago School, which we just talked about a little bit, and their main focus has been, you know, looking at patterns and what are the influences of certain patterns on spatial demographics and changes over time. And then there's systems theory, where there are component parts to a city is sort of made up of component parts, each of them functioning on their own, but influencing the way that other component parts function as well. And so there's going to be a reading here. I'll wrap up this short video and do some reading about that explains, you know, a little bit more about what these four ecological perspectives are in the context of the sociospatial approach to human ecology and urban ecology. So that's that reading. Then this comes from the Baltimore school, that textbook that we're using. So I'll wrap up this video, read through that, and keep working your way through the module.